If you're serious about photography, RAW files are probably already a part of your workflow. Let's find out how to exploit the enhanced capabilities of these files.
Before we begin discussing Adobe Camera Raw, let's first talk about why it's even necessary. If you own a high-end digital camera, it has the ability to shoot in what's called RAW mode. This provides numerous benefits to shooting JPEGs, including an expanded dynamic range and better image detail. The downside to the RAW format is that it cannot be processed directly in Photoshop. It must first pass through a RAW file converter, and that is where Adobe Camera Raw comes in. It transforms the file into a file format that Photoshop can handle, but it does so much more. It's a full-fledged editing tool in and of itself, offering a complete non-destructive workflow that retains every last ounce of quality from your camera file. How do you access Camera Raw? Well, that's simple. Point Photoshop to a RAW file. Let's go Open. Inside our Chapter 11 folder, I want you to select two files, Basic 01 and Basic 02. You can simply hold the Shift key to select the second file, and we'll select Open. Here's the Camera Raw interface. The first thing you'll notice is that both files open up in this film strip on the left. We'll begin with the first image, but before we start, I want you to go to your Camera Raw preferences that's located up here above the preview window. Click on the Preferences icon, and I want you to make sure that under General, you have Save Image Settings in set to Camera Raw Database, not Sidecar XMP files. Once that's verified, let's hit OK. If you're upgrading from an earlier version of Photoshop, you'll see a warning triangle down at the bottom of the image window. Version 6 of Camera Raw uses a whole new set of algorithms to convert the RAW file. Clicking on this icon will simply update your image to take advantage of the latest and greatest from Adobe. So let's just click this. Let's go through some of the fundamental editing tools in Camera Raw. They're conveniently grouped together in the Basic panel here on the right. The very first thing we want to do to an image is set its white balance or color correct the image. By default, Camera Raw picks up the white balance that comes directly from your camera. If you click on this pull down menu, there are a bunch of presets you can select from, but we're going to choose a much more precise method. Above the image window in your toolbar, we're going to select the white balance tool, this little eyedropper. To use this tool, you simply click on an area of the image that should be neutral. This image obviously has a warm color cast, but this wall should be white. So I'm going to click. Immediately, the color of the wall becomes a neutral white. The rest of the colors in the image are shifted accordingly. And if you'd like to fine-tune this adjustment, you can drag the temperature and tint sliders at the top of the Basic panel. After we set the white balance, we move down to this exposure slider. And we just determine whether the image is a little over or underexposed. I'm going to boost the exposure here a little bit simply by dragging the slider to the right. That looks much nicer. The recovery tool is what I like to refer to as a sometimes tool. This is what you use to recover blown highlights, and in this image we don't have any, so we're going to leave it at 0. In an upcoming lesson I'll show you precisely how to use recovery. We skip fill light temporarily and move right to blacks. This is where we set our shadow values. How deep, rich, dark are our blacks going to be? To use this effectively, we're going to move up here in the histogram window and turn on our shadow clipping tool. You'll notice at the top of her hair there are pixels that are colored blue. Those represent maximum blacks. It's a good practice to have some maximum blacks in your image, you just don't want to overdo it. The default value of 5 looks pretty good. We could maybe boost this up to 6 or 7, but that's about as far as we'd like to go because we don't want to lose any important detail. After you set your blacks, if you find that you are losing detail but you're happy with the added contrast to the image, you can simply use fill light to open up some of your near shadows. Again, this is a sometimes tool. The majority of your images will probably not need an adjustment to fill light. Next we move on to brightness, and as its name suggests, we can simply make the image brighter or darker. The difference between brightness and exposure is that brightness is a much more gentle result. So you want to be very conservative with exposure. And if after setting exposure you feel the image needs to go a little brighter, a little darker, just adjust the brightness slider. I might move up just a bit from the default to 50, but not too much. I'm going to turn off our shadow clipping previews so we're not distracted by those blue pixels. There's a contrast slider you can use to increase the contrast in your image. If you drag it to the right, the contrast will increase, your blacks will get blacker, your whites will get whiter. Our contrast looks pretty good, so I might just tweak it a couple of points. We've got a clarity slider that you can use to give your image a little bit more snap, a little bit more punch. To use this, I highly recommend viewing the image at 100% view. So we're going to go down to our view percentage menu and select 100%. I'm going to use the hand tool. This is the same shortcut in Photoshop of holding down the space bar, and we'll drag up so that we can see her face. And if I drag the clarity all the way to the right, you can see that there is a little bit more snap, but it's getting a little bit too contrasty. If we drag clarity all the way to the left, you can see it softens up the image. We've gone much too far here, and I'm actually going to leave clarity at its default of 0. We have two tools left, Vibrance and Saturation. I want you to use Vibrance. Vibrance is sort of a smart saturation tool in that it is much more gentle on the image and won't wreck your colors as easily as saturation will. Let's go back down to fit this into the view window. I'll choose Fit in View, and I'll boost the vibrance just a bit there. Not bad. Now all we've done is go through the basic panel, but I'm going to toggle the preview on and off. The checkbox is up here above the image window. You can also toggle this by hitting the P key on your keyboard. Here is where we started with no adjustments, and in just a few seconds of work, there's where we go. Nice and easy. Now I wanted you to open two files to show you an important feature of Camera Raw, and that's the ability to synchronize settings. So far we've made edits to just one file, but suppose we wanted to duplicate these settings to this second file, Basic02. Our top image is active. That means that it's showing up in our image preview window. If I hold down the Shift key and click on Basic02, that image is now selected. It's not active, but it is selected. Clicking on the Synchronize button gives me a pop-up window, and you can see a listing of every single adjustment parameter available in Camera Raw. A check mark next to the adjustment indicates that that will be applied to the second image. I can go to this pull-down menu and select some presets that will automatically select one of these adjustments. Here I'm going to choose white balance. This is going to synchronize the white balance from the first image to the second image. I'm simply going to hit OK, and now our second image is color balanced. I'll hit synchronize again, and I'm going to click on these options here. Everything that we've changed, I want to go and apply those from the first image to the second image. Click on Vibrance. Now when I hit OK, all of those settings are applied to the second image as well. Now we're ready to send a rendered file directly to Photoshop, either to make a print or do further editing. But first we've got some choices to make. We're going to open the Workflow Options dialog. We can access that by clicking on our current workflow settings. And you can see we can choose the workspace that we want to have. We can choose whether this will be an 8 or 16-bit image. We can even choose the size. If you choose a pixel dimension that does not have a plus or minus, that's sending the original file size. If you want to reduce the file size, you can do that here by selecting one of these presets. You could also increase the file size. We get to choose the resolution to which this file will be set, and we can even choose whether we want to apply any sharpening. Note down here the checkbox, Open in Photoshop as Smart Objects. If we select this, the image will open up in Photoshop as, you guessed it, a smart object. Let's just leave these values at the defaults and hit OK. If your settings are a bit different here, don't worry, it's not going to matter for what we're going to do in this lesson. Just go ahead and click OK. And now at the bottom of the window, we can click Open Images just to open both of these images individually in Photoshop. To the left, we could also choose to save these images. Perhaps we wanted to do more work later but did not want them to open immediately in Photoshop. If we click Save Images, we have options of where to save the file And we can choose whether it's going to be a JPEG, a TIFF, a Photoshop file, or simply leave it in its digital negative format. I'm going to hit cancel. We've made a lot of changes to this image, and when we open it in Photoshop, we have a lot of options as to what kind of file that is going to be. To continue on with our next lesson, we're going to be using a brand new set of raw files, so you can simply hit cancel. So far, the tools we've used have made global changes, that is, changes to the entire image. But Adobe Camera Raw offers some great ways to target specific areas of an image to work on. Let's get started by going to our Chapter 11 folder. I'm going to hit Control-O on the PC, Command-O on the Mac. And we're going to select the file Selective Edits. The first thing I'm going to show you how to do is limit our adjustments to specific colors within the image. We're going to go to the Hue, Saturation, and Luminance panel to do that. But first, I want to show you the Recovery tool in all its glory. I touched on it in the last lesson and promised to give you a closer look. Well, here it is. Notice in the upper right portion of this image, I have a completely washed out and blown out sky. There is no detail here, just a solid wash of cyan and white. How do I know that? Well, if I go and turn on my highlight clipping preview up here above the histogram, look at that area that is covered in a red overlay. That red signifies pixels that have no detail. They're all blown out at a maximum value. You can see down in my basic panel, I've already set my exposure a bit to the left at a minus 0.15, but that has had no effect on these blown out pixels here, and that is where the recovery tool comes in handy. Watch what happens to the image as I drag this slider to the right. You can see those red areas disappear like magic. Camera Raw is recovering highlight information, finding a way to pull detail out of areas that once were lost. It's actually able to reconstruct missing pixel information to give us full red, green, and blue values. Notice that there are still some scattered areas of red remaining, and this is a typical real-world result. Now, quite often you will be able to remove every last bit of red by dragging the recovery slider, but if you shoot in a very high contrast scene, you may end up with small pockets of red that Camera Raw could not reconstruct. But you can see that this is a marked improvement over where we started with the image. The recovery slider is a fantastic tool that's going to salvage a large number of your images. Now let's go to our Hue, Saturation, and Luminance panel. We get there by clicking on this fourth icon from the left, and look at all of these sliders here. We're going to start with Hue. You certainly know by now that I'm not going to say, oh, just play around with those sliders until you get something that you like. No, we have a much more precise way of working. First, let me turn off this highlight clipping preview. We don't need that anymore. To use the hue sliders here, we are going to visit our old friend, the Targeted Adjustment tool, which is located up here in the toolbar. And like the On-Image Adjustment tool in Photoshop proper, this tool works by clicking on an image area and dragging. Here we'll be dragging left to right. Now with the Hue tab selected, I'm going to click on these yellow shingles, drag to the left, and note the hue changes. If I drag to the right here, we can get a nice sort of a lemony lime kind of yellow. And what's great about this tool? Well, only those yellows have been shifted. We haven't changed the green in the trees, we haven't changed the blue or the reds in the house. The color that we click on is the color that gets adjusted no matter where it falls within the image. Let's go down here and click on the blue molding around this window. We'll click, we'll drag to the left. That gives us a more of a cyan kind of blue. Notice the reds are remaining untouched. Let's move here to the right and get something in the purple range. There we go. Let's move on to the Saturation tab. Here we've got the same set of sliders, but this time we're going to affect, you guessed it, saturation. If I click over here in this foliage, target these greens, and drag to the left, you can see my green slider is moving. The yellow is moving as well. Yellow is a secondary color in there. And you can see the foliage is now desaturated by a large amount. Let's actually take it back and boost the saturation up a bit. And let's do something to the red in here. We'll click on the red, and let's boost the saturation up here as well. See how easy it is to target specific colors. We simply click and drag. We're not having to make a mask. We're not having to make any kind of selection. It couldn't be easier. The last thing I'll do here is click and take a little saturation out of the yellow there. And let's move on finally to our luminance tab. Luminance is just a fancy word for brightness. So with these controls, we're simply going to brighten or darken colors here in the image. Let's go back and click on the green foliage, and what I want to do is brighten these a bit. There we go. We'll open them up right about there. Now let's take a look at how much work we've actually done. I'm going to toggle the preview off and on. Here's the file we started with. And here's the file after our adjustments. A huge change. So you can get a sense of how drastic a change you can make to an image without creating a mask, without defining any selections. You simply click and drag. Now let's get even more selective. Instead of altering similar colors throughout an image, suppose we want to limit our adjustments to specific locations in the image. Well, that's easy to do with the adjustment brush. That tool is located up here in the toolbar. We'll click that, and notice along the right we have a completely new set of options. Now exposure, brightness, contrast, saturation, etc., those should look familiar. They come from the basic panel, but here's the difference. These adjustments will be limited to the exact locations that we specify. And how do we determine those locations? Simply by painting. Let's get started by adjusting one of these parameters. I'm going to start with brightness. I'll drag this slider to the left. Notice the image has not changed. I have not told Camera Raw where to apply this brightness value of -74. As I move the mouse over the image, notice that I've got a crosshair, which is going to be very important in a moment, and I've got two circles. The innermost circle is our brush size. That's the diameter that we'll be painting with. The outer circle indicates our feathering. Now we can change size and feathering very easily. By moving down here, I can drag the size slider to the right to get a larger brush. I'll keep this back where it was at 6. That'll be pretty good for this. Feathering, I'm going to set that all the way to the right at 100. We want a nice soft edge brush here. And for our purposes, we are going to leave flow and density both set to their maximum values of 100. What I would like to do is take down the brightness of this tree. So I'm simply going to click and drag to paint. Now, two things should be very obvious. One, I've set a value that's much too strong. Two, I am spilling over here into the sky. Let's tackle that first issue. Here's the beauty of the adjustment brush. At any point after I have painted, I can readjust the settings. So I can back off this brightness slider here, give us something that's much more believable. And even though brightness was the only parameter that I adjusted, I could move the saturation slider, take color out of that, boost it to add more saturation. Let's set that back to 0. And this is the great thing about the adjustment brush. You paint, and then once you see visually what's happening, you can tweak any of these sliders to taste. Now let's take a look at what we can do about that spillover. I'm going to turn on this Show Mask checkbox, and now you will see a white overlay. This shows where I painted. That includes the diameter of the brush and the feathering. So you can see I've spilled out onto the edge of the roof, I've spilled out over into the sky. In short, I was very sloppy when I was painting. Let's turn off Show Mask for a moment. We're going to turn on the Auto Mask feature, and we're going to paint that area again. Before we do that, we want to get rid of the painting that we just did, and notice that we have this little bullseye icon here over the image. That's called a pin. The pin will be placed at the location at which you start painting, and a pin simply tells you that that adjustment brush is active. And because Camera Raw allows for multiple and separate brush adjustments, you can end up with multiple pins on a single image. We're going to delete the pin by simply pressing the delete key on the keyboard. Now I'm going to paint, and I'll do it just as sloppily as I did the first time. Notice that I have reduced the brightness setting, so I'm getting a much more realistic result right off the bat. Now that I've painted, let's go in and turn on the Show Mask preview. Notice now how my mask has been automatically limited. It didn't spill over into the edge of the buildings. It didn't spill over into the sky. When you turn on Auto Mask, that tells Camera Raw to limit your painting. And what does it limit it to? Well, I talked about that crosshair earlier. With Auto Mask turned on, Camera Raw looks at the colors that fall directly underneath your crosshair. No matter the size of your brush, no matter the size of your feathering, your adjustments will be limited to colors and tones that match what is directly underneath your crosshair. So as I was painting in here, I can be as sloppy as I want. I just make sure that the crosshair does not spill off of this foliage, and you won't have any spillover into these neighboring colors and tones. A very, very useful tool to use when you need to be really precise about your selections. I'm going to turn off Show Mask and Auto Mask. Those of you paying very close attention to the adjustment brush panel may notice a new option that we did not see in the basic panel. That's this color option here, so I'm going to quickly show you what that's about. This option lets us paint with a color, changing color in an image, but unlike with the hue slider, we can limit that color change specifically to where we paint. Now before we get started with this, I need to direct your attention to this pin up in the top of the tree. Notice that it has a black circle in it. That means it is active. Any change that we make to any of those adjustment brush settings will apply to that adjustment, and we don't want to do that, so I'm going to hit New. I'm going to make a brand new adjustment brush setting. Here I'm going to take brightness and set that to 0. I don't want to change the brightness. What I do want to change is color. So I'm going to click in this color swatch box, and I'm going to choose something in the orange range over here. Simply by clicking, I've got a brand new color. I hit OK. Now what I'd like to do is change the color of this window molding. Notice now the size of my brush relative to the window molding. What will happen if I paint like this? Yes, my color change will spill over onto the side of the building, and I don't want to do that. So back we go to our Auto Mask, turn that on, and with my slightly oversized brush, watch what happens. Notice that color change is not spilling over into the siding of this house at all. It is nicely being limited to exactly where we want it. We're not getting any spillover at all on that yellow siding. Perfect. Notice we have a second pin. This one has a black circle in the middle. That means it is active. Now if you look closely, you may see that we did get some spillover right where this house number is located. Why? Well, that purple matches the purple color on which we were painting. How can we fix that? Well, we can use, for the first time, the Erase brush. Let's go and click on Erase here. Now what this brush does is simply erase the effect that we just painted. Notice that we have size, feathering, and flow options there. We're going to leave those all at their defaults, and I'm simply going to click and paint over this area, taking out that adjustment that spilled over onto this identical color. How easy is that? The last tool I want to show you here is the graduated filter, and that's up in our toolbar right next to the adjustment brush. Once we select the graduated filter tool, you'll notice that the panel on the right looks identical to the adjustment brush panel minus the brush controls. You'll also notice that we've picked up our color setting from the adjustment brush. Now I don't want to change the color in this adjustment I'm about to make, so the first thing I'm going to do is turn this off. Click, and I'll move my hue down to 1 and drag my saturation slider all the way down to 0, in effect turning off that color change. Now the graduated filter tool behaves very similarly to the gradient tool in Photoshop in that it allows us to create an adjustment, have it begin at 100% or full strength, and make a nice seamless transition all the way down to 0%. This tool is most often used to control lighting in an image, and that's how we're going to apply it. So the first thing I'm going to do is drag my brightness value down here. And what I want to do is simply darken a portion of this sky I'm going to place the mouse in the upper right area of the image, and I'm simply going to click and drag down. And you can see we've got a darkening effect going on here. I'm dragging at an angle to match the slope of the roof, but if you want to drag in a straight line, hold down the Shift key while dragging. I'm going to put it just about there. The red dot signifies the end of this effect, so anything below the red dot in this case will not have the effect. At and above where our green dot is located, we have a full strength application of this adjustment. In between the green and the red dot, we have a nice seamless gradation from 100% all the way down to 0. Once you've drawn this, you can modify it. We could simply place the mouse along this dotted black line and move the entire gradient as a unit. I'll line it up just so it touches the roof. If we place our mouse close to the green circle, we have a double-sided arrow. We could drag this up to extend it. We could do the same thing where the red circle is. Notice, however, if I place the mouse further away from the red circle, I get a double bent arrow, which means I can rotate this adjustment in any direction. Let's line it up just about there. Looks pretty good. And again, as with the adjustment brush, I'm free after the fact to adjust my settings. So if that brightness looks a little bit harsh, I could back off of it slightly. And if I decide that I want to have this effect spill further down, I can simply click here, drag this red line down just about there. I'm going to touch up the angle just a smidgen. And there we go. We have no shortage of tools inside Camera Raw to perform selective edits. We are finished working with this image, so you can press the Cancel button. If you'd like to maintain these changes, however, and reopen the file later, simply press Done. Raw files will always be rendered in color, but with Camera Raw, you've got a fast, intuitive way to create a black and white version. Let's see how that works. In our Chapter 11 folder, we're going to open the file BW. Now, if you pay close attention to the basic panel, you may notice that I have already made a few small adjustments to this image. I've set a custom white balance, I've boosted exposure a little bit, and boosted my blacks. Even if you know from the outset you're going to convert to black and white, it's very helpful to make some basic adjustments to your image in color first. You want to get the image looking pretty good in color. This will make your conversion to black and white go much smoother and a lot faster. So you want to make sure you've got at least some pleasing contrast and exposure in your image before you even do the conversion. With that out of the way, let's go back to our HSL grayscale panel, and this time we're going to hit Convert to Grayscale. Now you can see under Grayscale Mix, Camera Raw is applying some auto settings. We're going to turn those off and click Default. And we'll zero everything out because we're going to start completely from scratch. Keep in mind that even though we're looking at a black and white version of this image, Camera Raw retains the underlying color information from the original file. It remembers the color of the sky, the color of the dome on the buildings, for example. So wherever we click to make an edit, Camera Raw will automatically limit those adjustments to areas of similar color in the image. As we make our edits, keep an eye on the sliders in the Grayscale Mix tab. That will show you the exact colors that Camera Raw has identified. Now let's go back up to our Tools panel and visit our old friend, the Targeted Adjustment tool. Now this works exactly the same way as it did in the previous lesson. We're simply going to click and drag over an area of the image. I'm going to start with the sky, and if I click and drag to the right, the sky will get brighter. What I'm going to do though is get a very dramatic sky by moving to the left, and I'm going to move pretty far. We want some heavy drama here in this sky. Now what I'll do is move down over the building right here on this brickwork. I'm going to click here. I can move to the right to brighten it, but I'm going to darken the building, but by a very small amount, nowhere near what we did to the sky. So I'm still able to adjust these two areas of the image independently. So now we've got a fairly dramatic black and white image. I will point out though that once you've made this conversion, you're going to find it helpful to revisit the basic panel and make a couple of final tweaks. So let's go click back on our basic panel. Most of the time what you're going to want to do is adjust your blacks. Once you convert from color to black and white, the image might feel like it loses a little bit of contrast, needs a bit of punch. So let's go down to our black slider and we'll boost this up. We're not going to overdo it, we just want to add some nice drama in here in the shadows. And with this image, we didn't really have a lot of distinct and separate colors. I'll toggle the preview on and off by clicking on the checkbox here. You can also press P on the keyboard. Here you can see we basically had two main color groups. We had the blue in the sky, and then we had sort of orange, reds, yellows in the building. I'll toggle this preview back on. So for an image like this, it's really a two-click solution. We darken the sky a lot, darken the building by a small amount, tweaked our blacks, and easy as pie, a rich, dramatic conversion to black and white. Even if your colors look good, most digital camera files are going to need a little bit of touch-up. Let's see how to fix some of the most common problems. In our Chapter 11 folder, we're going to open up 3 images this time. I want you to select Aberration, and then with the Command key on the Mac, Control key on the PC, I want you to select the image titled Crop, and then holding down the Command key on the Mac, Control on the PC, select Spotting. We're going to open up those 3 images in Camera Raw. Now let's start down here with the bottom image, Spotting. When we spot an image, we simply clean up defects and imperfections. And we've got a few in here. I'm going to zoom in to 100% view. Always view it 100% when you're going to be cleaning up an image. That will save you a lot of embarrassment later on when people zoom in and say, hey, that's not a very clean spotting job. We're going to remove the tea leaf that is stuck to the side of this teapot. Our spot removal tool is located in the tools bar. We're simply going to select that. And we have a radius set to 1, so we need a much larger brush size. Let's go and set this to about 6. I'm increasing this number by pressing my right arrow key. I could also just enter the number 6, or obviously move the slider with my mouse. Should work pretty well. There we go. Much nicer size. I'm simply going to click, and Camera Raw automatically does its best to find an appropriate point to sample from. That's a pretty good spot, except it's picking up a little defect in the cup here and duplicating that, so I'm just simply going to bring our sampling point over on the other side of the image, and we'll turn off the show overlay so we can get a clear look at what we've done. That looks pretty good. I'll make this a little bit wider, and let's try that. Perfect. Can't tell that it was done at all. Let's try something a little bit more difficult. With this tea leaf that's stuck, the problem is that it's butting up right against the edge. When you have a light and dark edge, that's a much more problematic issue to solve. But have no fear, we're going to go through this step by step. I'm going to reduce my brush size a bit because this fix is actually going to require 2 separate brushes. We'll set a radius of 4. I'm going to get rid of the bulk of the leaf here simply by clicking. And Camera Raw does a pretty good job of selecting there. Actually, it looks great. We're going to leave that. Now we're going to fix this area. So a separate click with the spot removal tool. And here you can see Camera Raw runs into some issues. I'm going to manually set the sampling point here. And now I'm going to adjust my removal point so that I can get this edge lined up. That looks pretty good. Let's turn off the overlay. Not bad if I do say so myself. So we've removed 2 spots there. Let's go up to our crop file. Now if we'd like to crop an image, we can simply go in the toolbar, select the crop tool. If we click and hold on the crop, we can use it in normal mode. That lets us drag a freeform crop. If we want to constrain ourselves to a certain ratio, we could choose 1:1. That'll give us a square, for example. Got plenty of other choices here, and you can also create your custom ratios. We're going to leave this set to normal, and I can simply click and drag a crop rectangle. When I release it, I can press the enter key to commit, and there we have a crop. Obviously with this image there's another problem. It is not straight. So we're going to back out of this, choose undo with the Command Z on the Mac, Control Z on the PC. Now instead of choosing the crop tool, we're going to select the straighten tool located just next to it. With the straighten tool, you look for something in your image that's supposed to be straight and simply drag along it with this tool. I'm going to choose the first row of bricks here above this detail work. So I'm going to click on the left edge, hold the mouse, and I'll release it when I get somewhere over to the right, and take care to keep my mouse located in the center of these bricks. So if I let go there, I now have a crop rectangle. You can see at the top of the toolbar that the crop tool is selected, and I can drag any one of these points and refine my crop. I'll come down just a little there from the top, but I'll move up a lot from the bottom. We'll do something like that, and I'll simply press the Enter key to commit, and there we have a much straighter image. The last thing I want to show you is how to fix the phenomenon of chromatic aberration. Well, what is chromatic aberration? It's a fancy term. I'll zoom into 100% here with Command plus on the Mac, Control plus on the PC. And let's shift over. I'll show you exactly what it looks like. Take a look at this American Express logo, and you can also see it in the black graphic on his shirt. Along the white edges, you can see sort of a red fringing. And that's what chromatic aberration is. It'll occur in your images where very light edges meet very dark edges. And you'll see a little bit of a red fringe. Sometimes it'll be blue or cyan or a bit of green. Let's go and fix this. Above the basic panel, we're going to select the icon for the lens correction panel. And we're going to choose the red cyan fringe slider and drag it to the left. If I go right down about there, you can see that the red fringe is gone, but now I have introduced a little bit of a yellowish green. So I'm going to go down to this blue-yellow fringe slider and drag this to the left. About down there, looks pretty good. Now I've got a pretty clean line between the light and dark edges. I'm going to toggle the preview on and off. Here's where we started from. So you can see now those reds are really popping out. And here is our fix. Much better. 3 common image problems, 3 easy solutions in Camera Raw.